that's, I guess, the crux of this. I'll bet a lot of people are listening going, tell me what to do. What is the solution I should use, right? And there are a lot of organizations out there that are working hard to come up with solutions. When an organization is trying to decide what solution do I use, how do they choose? Hello and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics podcast. My name is Jen Stone. I'm one of the principal security analysts here at SecurityMetrics. And if you are in the PCI world, you're probably deep into what do I have to do for 4.0 for March of 2025, right? Especially if you have e-commerce. So there are a lot of people who are dealing with what are these new requirements for e-commerce? I'm going to say a couple numbers, and if you're in the middle of it, you will know. And this is the show for you. 643 and 1161. These topics are so big that I'm not doing it with just one person. I have three people here to help me, and I want them to introduce themselves. I think you've seen all of these people in previous podcasts, but I just want, for the people who are new, let's do a quick introduction. Let's starting with Aaron.
My name's Aaron Willis. I'm the Vice President of Forensic Investigations here at SecurityMetrics. I've been in the industry for almost 30 years, 15 of those here at SecurityMetrics. Also been a professor of digital forensics at Utah Valley University and run several businesses, technology related.
Great. Gary.
Hi, I'm Gary Glover. I'm the Vice President of our assessment team here at SecurityMetrics. So we do the IT audit and helping people do compliance assessments. And I've been here working at SecurityMetrics for about 20 years now. Before that, doing other things like software development and aerospace engineering.
And Chad.
Hi, my name is Chad Horton. So I'm the VP of Technology here at SecurityMetrics. I've been performing penetration tests for about 18 years. And about 6 years ago, Aaron and I got super interested into e-commerce skimmers. And ever since then it's become my passion. And with 1161 coming out, I was the guy for the job. So I've been able to work on our technology here at SecurityMetrics.
Thank you all for joining me. I'm really glad that you're here. And so just to kind of give some background, before we jump into what do we have to do for 643 and 1161, maybe we should back it up and say, what is this problem that we're talking about?
And I'd like to start because I think one of the PCI requirements years and years ago was on software development. And if people are doing software development, they have to be in charge of making sure that things on their website is secure, like securely coded. There's always those requirements for secure coding. And years ago we started, and I think maybe even before Aaron and Chad started thinking about it, we were telling people, well, you got to at least know what you're including on your pages and compare them or do something. And so we were talking to him about it. There was no tools in the industry. There was nothing that we could really enforce there, but it was mainly how are you looking at those tools? So for years, we've known that people have to look at these include files. And I think then Aaron and Chad started seeing people actually mess with those.
Yeah, we started getting forensic investigations coming in, full PFI investigations. And our typical method was to download a snapshot of the server, tear it apart in the lab, and kind of go through that checkout process line by line in the code if needed, and find out where the bad guys had inserted some PHP or something to steal those credit cards. We started getting cases where, we were the third PFI to look at it, but we didn't find anything. There was nothing on the server that indicated that there was a problem, or, no traditional PHP skimmers or any other server-side skimmers. And so we started looking in the browser and noticed that malware was appearing right when the customer was typing in their credit card data. There was nothing on the server that would ever lead us to find that skimmer that was running or executing just in the browser itself. And Chad was instrumental in helping us find that as well.
As a penetration tester, we actually started playing around with skimmers about 2017, when one of our developers built a test environment for my analysts to practice against, and they threw in a skimmer that would hijack the credit card information just to see if any penetration tester would find it. Sure enough, I didn't find it. And rather assuredly, that became a passion of mine because I now had to figure out how that worked, how I would detect it. And so, as Aaron mentioned, I got the opportunity to work with him when the time came up, and it was super cool to see these things in action.
So this is something that this team has been really interested in and has seen it as a problem for years, not just recently.
Not since 4.0, yeah. Not just a 4.0 issue, right?
Yeah. Yep. So
this is going back a number of years now.
And it's something that we're actually seeing have in the wild. Like people are actually being breached because of this issue.
It's kind of a natural progression. When the shift went to e-commerce, the attackers followed, right? They just went where the low-hanging fruit is. And so as e-commerce became more prevalent, that's where the attackers went to start grabbing those credit cards. And so we did everything to lock down the server-side environment. We had the file integrity monitoring and the antivirus and your IDS, IPS, your firewalls, your WAFs, all these things that we put in place to try to lock that down. And so the attackers went where we didn't have any eyes, and that was in the browser. There was that security gap where nobody really had eyes on what was happening at that critical moment of checkout when the customer was typing in the credit card data. And so, we try to solve that by throwing iframes in there and trying to separate that piece of it away from the merchant's side. Right. And that worked great for a while. Of course, right. If the hackers get into the website and they've got long enough, they're going to figure out how to get around that iframe.
Right. And I think that's a good point. I mean, we saw the big hit to e-commerce as soon as the chips on the cards, EMV chips on the cards here in the United States got to be more. I think it happened earlier in Europe. They were actually seeing more e-commerce. So the shift over to e-commerce was caused by more security in stores. Those card-present environments, when they got more secure, then they went to e-commerce. And I remember when SAQA, kind of started changing and morphing, and they said, well, now there's these iframe things, and everybody was really excited about iframes. And there was this big push to move from any other SAQ to SAQA. So we had all kinds of universities and other people that were, online people moving to an iframe as a way of saying, now we're secure. Now we only have to do very few things. Yeah. Now we're awesome. And so I think the industry for a long time, and frankly, I think even now, I was on a website yesterday for a web development environment, and they are saying we use Stripe, so that way we don't have to do PCI. And I go, no, wait a minute, you do e-commerce.
Untrue.
And you're just so in other words, I think it's still a pretty big misconception amongst many people in the industry that this really is a deal for them. They still think iframes are protecting them. So I think over the next few years, the whole industry has to learn and understand these attack vectors. And that's what we're trying to help you understand today, or that's what the council is trying to have you understand with the addition of these requirements.
The example that I like to use, and I've mentioned this in many times, but it's like putting a safe in your house. You can have the best safe in the world. That doesn't mean you don't lock your doors and windows.
Right.
You've got to do that perimeter security around those iframes. If an attacker gets into your house and they're in there for long enough, they will figure out how to get into that safe. If they're in your website, even though you've got that iframe and you've outsourced a lot of the responsibility to your payment provider, given enough time, the attacker is going to figure out how to get data out of that iframe.
So, and I think this is why a lot of people, merchants especially, are kind of frustrated right now, because they thought, I'm using iframes, I'm doing the SAQA, I'm good, I have very little I have to do, I'm outsourcing this. And all of a sudden, this feels like a big deal, and it kind of is a heavy lift in some ways. But I try to explain to my customers, this is something we're actually seeing. As a matter of fact, you, I think, took a report to the PCI Council.
Right. So, and that's one thing I think that's helping the industry really kind of understand where the problem is. There's two programs here that we've had at SecurityMetrics to do some research. One of those, our CEO really kind of loves to do, and that's something he calls risk check. So he has downloaded the got a database of 96 million websites throughout the world, and we checked those and found out of those, 56 million, e-commerce sites that we know are e-commerce. And we can run through those e-commerce sites with just a quick set of things we know will be not a false positive. In other words, it's like a VA scan, a very small vulnerability scan. And because we're an ASV scan vendor, we kind of know what things really are not false positive, what things turn up as false positive. So we picked a number, a handful of things that we knew were going to result in compromises potentially to their websites. So he checked the internet a number of times. It takes a day or two to do the whole 56 million, and the results found that basically 29.9% of the e-commerce websites out there throughout the world were vulnerable to one of these big major attacks. So that means 30% of the e-commerce websites might be vulnerable. And if they're an SecurityMetrics merchant, that means they're vulnerable. That means somebody can get in. So out of 56 million is basically 15.5 million or something like that, websites that could be available for attack, which is a pretty big number for the bad guys to go after. So that's the first piece of data that was important for us to understand, that there's a big chunk of people out there that just aren't protecting their edge very well, which then resulted in or can result in the reason for the ASV scans for SecurityMetrics merchants. So SecurityMetrics merchants now have to do vulnerability assessment scan where they didn't before.
Yeah.
There's a reason why 30% of them were bad. So that's the first piece, which is frustrating probably SecurityMetrics merchants, is that they've got to do a vulnerability scan.
Mm-hmm.
That's right away. And then future data is this script scanning stuff that we've been talking about, script analysis. It's not really a scan. It's not like an ASV scan at all. I don't want to make that distinction, but then Aaron had done a lot of research. We've got a lot of kind of forensics we've done on level 4 merchants over the past number of years. I think over 2,000.
Yeah,
right?
we're well over 2,000.
Well over
now,
2,000 of those.
3.
Yeah, coming up on 3,000. And so it's not a small sample. It's a pretty large statistical sample of websites. And during that investigation, Aaron's team is looking not only at the scripts that are present on the referring page, which is the page that holds the iframe, the thing that you look through to see the third-party site, but we're also looking at the scripts that are loaded into the browser dynamically from the service provider. So we're seeing the whole process from soup to nuts. And correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, but at the time when we did this analysis, 100% of all the cases where data was being compromised, it was being compromised on the merchant side, the small SecurityMetrics merchant side, not on the service provider side.
That's correct. The malware 100% of the time always came in on the merchant side of the iframe.
Right. So to me, that completely illustrates, and that was the kind of the gist of this little paper, this report we provided to the council first and now to the industry. You can download it. Maybe there'll be a link under this podcast somewhere. That shows where this problem is occurring. It's not occurring on the service provider side. Service providers are usually better at writing code. They're usually better at protecting sites. And not to say that there isn't 1 or 2 or 5 or something that have this problem, but it's overwhelmingly a small merchant problem. So it's not a requirement that you can just say, oh, let's just ignore this one for now. We'll have the service providers fix it. And I think that comes from the whole feeling of, no, I've outsourced to a service provider.
Yeah.
He should handle this for me.
Yeah.
I have a website that uses Stripe. I just outsource to them. Why is it my problem? What we're illustrating here today and in these reports is that it really is the small merchant problem. It's the referring page problem.
And the confusion is understandable, because a merchant that implements an iframe, they really don't get the credit card, right?
Right.
The customer types it in and it gets sent back to the payment provider gateway. It gets authorized. A token gets sent back. The merchant ideally doesn't store that card data. So a merchant is really feeling justified when they say, hey, why are you looking at me? I never even saw the credit card. Go talk to somebody else.
Right.
And so, that's how the merchant is feeling.
Yeah.
Like, I paid for somebody else to deal with this problem.
Right.
And I'm also hearing this one. It's happening in the browser. Shouldn't the browsers be fixing this problem?
It goes all the way back. I mean, you could look at it as a browser issue. It's these latest attacks that we're seeing with iframe circumvention. It's based on the way that the browsers handle the rendering of the iframes. At the end of the day, it's just another HTML element.
Yeah.
And you can use JavaScript to mess with HTML
It's
elements.
just a program. You can address something like
you can go hit those attributes and properties of an iframe and mess with them. And attackers have gotten really clever and figured out that, hey, iframes have a source attribute. Let's go play with it.
But that's working as designed, right?
Yeah.
The browsers are actually working the way they're designed. And so to say it's a browser problem, the browser needs to fix it, let's wait till the browsers fix it, I think that's the wrong solution.
That's not going to happen.
That is not the correct solution.
It would take a fundamental rewrite of the technology to fix that problem.
And that's simply not going to happen. And that's what I told him was, look, if you have an issue on your page, you're responsible for that. And it doesn't matter how angry you are at the browser. Yeah. It's the solution is really, let's look at how to fix the vulnerability in the merchant page.
Yeah, the safe is still in your house. You still have to lock your doors and windows. You're not going to get out of that responsibility.
Which then leads us to why the changes have been made in 4.0. Specifically, the ones that are going to affect people most, I think, is the SAQA merchants. They're not used to these, weekly things, daily things, whatever that need to be, these scans and these analysis of the scripts.
And these are big and sometimes confusing language, especially if you're a merchant and you're outsourcing all of your technology and all of a sudden you get hit with a requirement that has language in it that you don't understand. That can be difficult. And so I wanted to go over what the language is first and then talk about what it means. And then maybe see if we can talk about, from a technical perspective, what solves this. So starting with 643, all payment page scripts that are loaded and executed in the consumer's browser are managed as follows. A method is implemented to confirm that each script is authorized. A method is implemented to assure the integrity of each script, and an inventory of all scripts is maintained with written business or technical justification as to why each is necessary. So this is going to be required in March 31st, 2025. But honestly, everything that we're seeing says you should be doing this now because the problem is out there. And just because it's not required until March 31st doesn't mean you're not going to have a breach before then, right?
Yeah. 6.4.3 is really telling the merchants you have to know what is going on under the hood. Behind the scenes, what are you loading on your checkout page when that credit card is present? You have to know what's there.
I would take it a step further and say the merchant needs to know what is loaded on the page, why they're loading it on the page, and when it changes. And whether that's the merchant or who they've hired out to, the third-party provider, someone needs to be aware and keeping track of that.
And I think that's the point of having it. The council, I think when they wrote 643, they were thinking, this will be great. This will fix them. If we make a list of all the scripts they've got to have, then clearly they'll want to reduce that number. So far, that really hasn't happened.
I haven't seen that either.
That control will be it. So it is about awareness. Maybe it will affect some people saying, wow, we got 50 or 60 or 100 or whatever scripts on here. I don't really want to know what they all are. Do we really need these? Marketing, do we need these? Yeah, well, all right. You don't have to have them if you don't want to. So that's a process that could happen, which would be a good effect of 643. It may reduce the number of scripts just because people say, well, why are we doing this? So it's an awareness thing.
And we do see a large number of scripts that are present. Sometimes we've seen over 300 individual JavaScripts and libraries that get loaded on the checkout page when the card data is there. If you think about that, that's a massive surface area that is potentially open to attack.
Right.
In a point of sale environment, if you wanted to introduce something on the back house server or something in the payment process, that thing had to be vetted and looked at and approved. And now we're kind of just in the wild, wild west with e-commerce. Everybody wants us to throw a business analytics script in there because it's profitable, right?
Sure.
If you can throw a script in there that tells you when your customer is abandoning that cart, that's valuable information.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask Chad, you made a point, you said up to 300. So Chad and both of you maybe, that means 300 different URLs, or do they come from one URL sometimes?
Well, that's kind of the top level URL. That's a URL loading in scripts. There could be thousands of other scripts coming in from those. Some of these libraries open up into just massive amounts of code. What's your take, Chad?
Yeah, it definitely is. It's you've got multiple layers. So one script may load, and that may load 2 more scripts, and then one of those scripts may load 3 more. So you've got this natural loading of additional content on there.
Kind of a daisy chain. I think our record is finding malware 7 layers deep.
Oh my goodness.
And the thing is once you get past that, for like merchants today don't even know what the first layer looks like. And so talking about 7 layers deep is just stuff that they're not even aware of.
Right.
But towards your point, Gary, of like one of the outcomes could be that people say, hey, we didn't even know we had all this stuff on there. Maybe we should remove one. We have already seen instances where we're reporting to merchants saying, hey, look, you're putting ad networks on the same page that you're receiving credit card data. And we've had merchants within hours respond to us and say, didn't realize I was doing that. We fixed it. Test us again. We need to make sure that that's gone.
And to your point, Chad, I think that that's absolutely going to spur some behaviors with some, especially small merchants, because what I see when I talk to people is you've got your IT team typically responding to the audit, and they're saying, we get told to put these scripts on. We don't know where they're from. We don't know who the owner is. And so they don't have a good way to continue to manage those scripts because they're not even sure if the original reason they were put on is a valid reason still. I got asked this a couple of weeks ago. Should I just delete any scripts that I can't identify? And I said, I think you should talk to your leadership about how they want to handle it before you go deleting things. But that is the kind of the final solution. You have scripts on your page that nobody is taking ownership of. Nobody knows where they came from. Well, I'm pretty sure that's tag for deletion, right?
To your point, Jen, we had a recent forensic case where they were using just an off-the-shelf shopping cart solution, but they had published the code and it included all of the payment scripts necessary for a number of different payment vendors that they weren't even using.
Oh.
That code was out there. Attackers were able to get in. They manipulated some of that external code to offer an occasional customer a payment option that the merchant wasn't even accepting. And so they were just using code that was already there that wasn't in use. They just made a few little changes and they were able to get a fake checkout process put in place using code that was already there. Not malicious code. Mm-hmm. They just made it malicious by injecting a few lines of JavaScript.
Let's also talk about 11.6.1 because 6.4.3 and 11.6.1 really go hand in hand. So allow me to read through this one and then we can maybe dig into how we solve this problem with what kind of solutions will address these things. So 11.6.1 says, a change and tampered detection mechanism is deployed as follows. To alert personnel to unauthorized modification, including indicators of compromise, changes, additions, and deletions to the security impacting HTTP headers and the script contents of payment pages as received by the consumer browser. The mechanism is configured to evaluate the received HTTP headers and payment pages. The mechanism functions are performed at least once weekly or periodically as determined by a targeted risk assessment. So this is this brings another view into what we're trying to do, the reducing the changes or the potential compromise of the scripts on the page, not just knowing about it, but knowing as Chad was saying earlier, have they changed?
Yeah, going into that, it's not only like have they changed, but looking for indicators of compromise associated with those. If you are IT, for example, going back to what you said earlier, and you're like, hey, we're just told to add JavaScript onto the web page, and you get notified another one got added, how do you know whether that was normal, expected, or not? So many organizations, especially smaller merchants, are not set up to even respond to those or know how to. And so I think one of the key things that we've really focused on and felt like is important in this requirement is identifying indicators of compromise. Is that JavaScript that was added on there, is it accessing card data? Are there new HTTP requests sending off malicious or potentially malicious data? And so being able to identify when something is suspicious going on in that page, something that wasn't happening before, it's happening now, someone needs to take a look at it.
Right. So then I run into people that say, well, this doesn't seem too complicated. We'll have a spreadsheet of our scripts that are on our page, and then we'll do CSP headers. We should be good. And I've had to answer, probably not. That's probably insufficient. So,
and I think this is going to be one of the hardest things over the next year or two, not only for the small merchant, the service providers, but also for QSAs. And I represent that community. I'm excited to have both of these other guys here with us today because they're the real guts behind this. And frankly, I think we might be in a good position here at SecurityMetrics to help people understand why these are happening, why these requirements are here, and then how to really know what they mean. We've spent, Chad and everybody on the team have spent months looking and trying to read and figure out what the best things are. And I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and they were reading it too, and they can read it a totally different way than we read it, right? And I had one person say to me, they read it and said, well, this doesn't really apply to me. And I'm going, no, wait, it does. So I don't think that we can just assume that the council was perfect in their language. I think they did their best at the time. It's a good requirement. They did it, they wrote it based on what was really happening, the forensics. And so in other words, what we have here are people that are actually knowing why this requirement was written.
Yeah.
And so we have a unique perspective in being able to say, well, now I understand what they're trying to say in the requirement because we see it happening.
And absolutely, I'm so glad that you framed it that way, because I want to know what needs to be in place to solve this problem, not against the pedantic reading of the requirement, but in a way that's going to actually solve this problem and prevent or make us aware of breaches in this situation, because these were written for a very specific challenge. And I think you are aware of the challenge and how to address it. And that's what I'd like to dive into next is, what does it take from a technical perspective to address this challenge?
Yeah. And I'd like to hear discussion between these guys. At what level does this analysis have to take place at? And so we can help people understand that.
Well, if you think about what 6.4.3 and 11.61 are asking, it's asking merchants to know what's on your checkout page. As Chad said, know why it's there. 11.6.1, monitor it. Mm-hmm. Make sure that what is there is what's supposed to be there and it's not getting changed in malicious ways. And so technically to do that presents a number of unique challenges. We've had Chad working on those solutions. But 6.4.3, we talked about the sheer number of scripts, right, that a merchant could have on their site. Expecting a small merchant to go in and really inventory what could be potentially be thousands of JavaScripts, once they all get unbundled, that's a huge ask. That's a technical requirement that is very challenging to know. I think, Chad, you found a whole bunch of JavaScripts just recently, right, that we didn't even know were there. They were getting injected into another iframe.
Yeah, it's all about what you determine is the scope of how you're going to evaluate what JavaScript is running on the page.
It can really get confusing even on determining, well, what is running on my page. That requires some technical knowledge and technical analysis to even figure out what's in scope.
Yeah, and for those technical nerds, I'll talk a little bit more about that, because you've got like event handlers, that's JavaScript that's in line with the HTML element as it's defined. You've got inline scripts. You've got scripts that are sourced from third parties. You've got scripts that are sourced inside a JavaScript or inside of sub iframes that post messages back and forward with the mainframe. And you'll have iframes that are sometimes nested 2 or 3 layers deep. And so when you start talking about the technical implementation of wrapping your mind around what it says in 643 of inventory all scripts that run on the page, that becomes a monumental task. And so for anyone like me who understands how the browser works, you step back and you're like, how is any mom and pop shop ever supposed to find success here?
And when you get really technical, you can even argue about what the page is.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to ask that question, because I'll get this. Well, we have FIM on our payment page, but a payment page isn't a static thing, right? Can you maybe describe a little bit about how the final form, how we get to the final form, and how you go from what is maybe the ASV scan is seeing what is just out there at the beginning of a payment page.
Yeah, I would love
evolution, right? Can you talk about what I'm trying to say?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm super passionate about this one. So when you look at like a payment page, for example, like a website, the biggest thing that you need to know is the payment page or the referring page, depending on which type of checkout you're doing, is the page that either embeds a third-party iframe where the credit card number is going to be typed in, or it accepts the actual credit card number. If you were to look in the URL for that path of how you navigate to that, if you open a new browser, you cannot navigate directly to that page because the application itself requires you to have state. You have to have an item in your checkout, in your shopping cart. In some websites, you have to be logged in and authenticated, and then you have to go to the checkout page. And so from a high level, you can start by saying, well, the page is going to be the page that either embeds the third-party iframe, which is a referring page, or it's going to be the page that accepts the credit card number. But then it gets even more complicated, because if you're looking at it from a developer's perspective, it's all about what the DOM is doing, the document object model. Now, most web developers are actually oblivious to this, and I can speak from experience. As a pen tester, I've assessed probably close to 1,000 different websites. Web applications. So I've spoken to my fair share of developers, and I've developed some myself as well. But the document object model is what loads in the browser when you go to a website. Well, in some websites, that document object model is created once at the very beginning. And even though you click on the login button and then you log in and the page looks like it's refreshing, it's actually just modifying that DOM.
Changing the views.
Right.
It's just changing the views. And this is called a single page application. And so the question becomes is the payment page where that DOM was originated, where it first was created? Because if I load a JavaScript on that first view, and then 10 views later, I'm entering the card data, that JavaScript from the first view can impact that card data. And so for single page applications, your payment page or referring page may be your whole website.
And that could be huge,
right? This is such a complicated topic for anybody to understand, let alone merchants who don't have technical experience.
And we do see malware skimmers that get loaded in those single page applications all the way at the beginning. And then, 30 minutes later, after the customer's done shopping and they type in that credit card, that script was just waiting there the whole time, just waiting for that number to get typed in.
So you can't look just at the script on that initial page. You can't look just at the scripts on the page when it's loaded the first time. You can't look just at the page that accepts the payment. You have to look at the full evolution of the DOM in that single page application, because it could exist anywhere, and wherever it exists could affect the security of the credit card information. Did I get that right?
Yeah. And if you're in a traditional
if I'm a non-technical merchant at this point, I'm ready to give up.
Yeah.
Yes. If you're in a traditional application, it's a little bit simpler because it does refresh that DOM on every single page. And so it can be just the URL, but you have to have the state. But ultimately, it's a complex, even for some merchants to identify where do I need to be looking? They don't even know where to start.
Chad, you and I talked a while ago about this concept of generated scripts and dynamic scripts, and we have to think of this document object model that you're talking about. This web, basically, it's kind of the browser environment, the development environment, even, or whatever. But in a totally dynamic way, it's not something that you can just say. I think file integrity monitoring, I'm used to in the old days just saying, well, let's just look at the contents of the HTML as it's loaded, and then we'll know what's on the page. That's not really the way things work anymore.
No. Oh, no. You've got so much dynamic content. As Aaron alluded to earlier, we've got tracking scripts that are literally changing what they're sending each time based on how you interact with the page. You've got ads, unfortunately, still today on the checkout page that are changing what type of JavaScript is being pulled in. And even marketing modules, when you're dealing with like Magento or standard applications, they'll have marketing based on where you're from geographically and what you've looked at on the page. They're going to load different modules on that page as well. Different HTML will come up. And so there are so many different factors that can play a part into this DOM changing that it's hard to get a firm grasp of how are we even going to measure it.
Yeah, and some checkout pages are just so dynamic. There's the funnel marketing that can produce a dynamic checkout page for any number of different products, depending on how people came in. And so we've seen checkout pages being served from different domains, being shared among different merchants. And so it can get really complicated to figure out what is my checkout page.
Right. So from Jen and I's perspective as QSAs, some of this stuff is really interesting, but I'm not sure that every QSA in the world is an expert on the DOM, an expert on all of this stuff.
I can guarantee you this is a hard conversation.
This is a hard conversation, and it's a hard topic to really grasp. So if we jump back up higher a little bit for Jen and I's purpose, for Jen and I's view, what are some things that you two guys could teach our audience about this analysis process? What is 11.6.1? It has to happen in the DOM. What does that really mean? And how can we help as QSAs help our customers understand that? Or what things can we do as a company to help communicate what this analysis really needs to be and what it needs to look at? I mean, I have been working on it. You guys have been working on it. So
you can really think of the browser environment as a virtual machine, a virtual computer that's running on your customer's computer, that is processing all of those JavaScripts and doing all of these dynamic things. And that piece is really what we're looking to protect with 11.6.1 and 6.4.3. And so it gets really complicated, as Chad was explaining, but really we're just trying, with these two things, we're trying to get merchants to get measures in place so that they know what's running on the checkout process in 11.6.1, to monitor those things for indicators of compromise, so that if something does happen, it gets detected right away and it's not 6 months of card data loss. And so that, at a simplified level, that's all we're trying to do. And it does get complicated under the hood, but we're working on tools that are really going to make it a whole lot easier for merchants, especially the small merchants.
Chad, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to build on what he said. If I were to approach this and I was talking to a small merchant, my first advice would be identify how you're processing the card data today. Like I said, you can't know where to apply any sort of solution or what type of solution. You had briefly brought up like CSP, and I hope we come back to that because I do have some comments on that. But start by identifying what type of processing of cards you're doing. Are you hosting it yourself? Or have you outsourced this in an embedded iframe, or do you have a hard redirect? Because once you have that knowledge, then that's going to change what type of solutions you're going to look for. The type of what looks like an indicator of compromise for a hard redirect is completely different than if it's a hosted page. The types of restrictions I'm going to talk about with my QSA, or whether that just be internally, of how we're going to monitor this, whether or not certain JavaScript should be on that page or not. It's going to change based on whether we redirect to someone else or whether we take the card data itself. So first off and foremost, I would say start by identifying how you process credit cards. I know this is going to be scary, but ask your developers if you're a single page application or not. If you are and you're not technical, I would say that probably is a sign that you need to go and talk to someone who is an expert on it, or work with those developers to try and find it. If you're not a single page application, then maybe there's some solutions that you can come and you can look at trying to implement yourself.
So back to my original comment on the spreadsheet of scripts and the CSP header. How come that's not sufficient?
And let me start with this discussion. I want to let you guys go off on it here in a minute, but as an experience thing, this is Jen and I, we get these experiences talking to people. I had a customer say to me, well, I read in 4.0, and this was the first version of 4.0, in 11.6.1, the guidance basically said, it sounded like it could be interpreted as being said, you can use any one of the following solutions. And it had a list of a number of bullets. CSP was one of them, SRI, all these different things. And when I talked to the people at the council who actually kind of wrote this, I said, is that your intent? And they said, no, really, it was just examples of things that could be put together to create a solution to do this problem. So I had a customer say to me, well, no, CSP is one of those bullets. Yeah. That's all I want to do. And I'm going, no, they rewrote that in 4.0.1 and actually made it say could be made up of of a number of the following. So that's kind of a preview to what people are so careful about reading these requirements and trying to think, I got to do the minimal amount I want to do.
Because they want to get out of the work rather than addressing what the real problem is.
So why is CSP itself not enough? Is that a Chad start off?
Yeah, I'll dive into that one. I was the one who asked it to come back up. So CSP was a browser solution to try and solve the problem of how do we prevent JavaScript from executing in the page that we don't want to execute. It's funny because this ties directly back to what we talked about before. Isn't this a browser problem?
Yeah.
They be giving us the solution. Ironically, CSP came out years before even the PCI was talking about what could we do as a solution. To paint a picture here, in 2020 during COVID, during the lockdown, for the remote PCI North America community meeting, I actually gave a presentation on using CSP and SRI to identify skimmers in the wild. So this solution has been talked about and thrown around, and there's a lot of great advantages that you get with CSP. Ironically, even 4 years ago, my conclusion was CSP is great and it has opportunities where it can identify skimmers. However, from experience, I can tell you they're false positive prone. Many browser extensions to this day can still cause false positives, where the browser extension triggers traffic that gets interpreted as a potential skimmer. Number two is that CSP itself is extremely difficult for the average developer to be able to configure properly. We just talked about before that JavaScript gets loaded in as like a daisy chain, and you can have layers and layers and layers deep. Developers, and I've seen this on a pen test side again, that developers will go and write a CSP and they'll lock it down and they're like, aha, we got it. And then they load up the page in production because they just pushed it and nothing will load because they didn't realize that this JavaScript over here depended on this JavaScript way down here that came from a third party.
Yeah.
So CSP is hard to get right. Out of close to 1,000 different websites that I've assessed, and I've probably seen CSP on around 15 to 20% of those, I've probably seen one or two that were actually written correctly where I wasn't able to bypass it. Mm-hmm. Like less than a 1 to 2%. There are so many common ways that people make mistakes when writing the CSP. They don't consider the exceptions. They don't consider how they're whitelisting them. And so there's so many pitfalls with it. It literally is a foot gun. You use it, but it's at your own risk. And so I think that
it can't be a solution in and of itself, right?
Yeah. And that goes to what Gary is saying there, which is even if you get it all right and you put it into place, the problem is the third bullet point, Jen, that you had mentioned was you have to make sure that it's running correctly weekly. And the CSP, there's no way to check whether that CSP has been modified automatically. So someone would have to be going into the website and looking for that.
So it's not a set and forget solution.
Oh, definitely not. I mean, it's the exact opposite, because if I'm an attacker, going back to what Aaron said earlier, and I've got access to your e-commerce environment, I can change what's on the page, but I can also change the headers. So if you have CSP, it's just one more step for me to go in and change the header before I change the page. Right. It's not that big of an obstacle for an attacker to get around.
Right.
And so many times in our forensic cases where merchants have lost credit card data, we found that CSP was implemented, but it either wasn't implemented correctly or the malware was whitelisted. Or it was coming in from malvertising where the ad network was whitelisted.
Come through. Right.
And so, the malware got in and CSP was essentially defeated.
Right. So CSP would protect something as it was being loaded or as it was coming from a place you didn't recognize. And that's why this analysis has to happen. You just said, well, I whitelisted the malware. I wanted that ad to come through, and that's where it came from. So there's one of the reasons why just that solution itself won't work, because the guys that designed your website, the marketing people, said, no, we need to whitelist that area. And that's where the bad stuff came from. So CSP would never find it, right?
Well, yeah, now change your statement there, Gary, a little bit from I whitelisted the malware to I whitelisted the CDN that we get all of our JavaScripts from. I mean, we've seen this on even CDNs that have this. So you whitelist your CDN, that CDN gets compromised, and now that malicious JavaScript can come in. So it can be a trustworthy host, a trustworthy source.
Right. That's a better way to say that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And building on CSP, SRI, again, another browser solution that they gave us to equip developers to proactively protect against this. The problem is the vast majority of JavaScript that's loaded today in the browser is dynamic. It changes every time. And so SRI was great 10 years ago when it first came out. Like, yes, there's everything that we can do to lock down and make sure these JavaScript files don't change. But as Web 2.0 has turned into Web 3.0, which has turned into Web, I don't know, but whatever it is, complex.
Whatever, yeah.
We're no longer static. Everything is dynamic. And because everything is so dynamic anymore, even SRI, what the developers years ago from these browser companies, and I want to give them compliments and call outs here because they're great developers. They see this as a problem and they're trying to help. But it's not a problem that even they are equipped or positioned to solve.
So solutions.
Well, and that's I guess the crux of this. I'll bet a lot of people are listening going, tell me what to do. What is the solution I should use, right? And there are a lot of organizations out there that are working hard to come up with solutions. I think when an organization is trying to decide what solution do I use, how do they choose?
Right. And I think this is a good opportunity for talk about kind of the two major categories of those solutions. And I'll let these guys pontificate more about them. But in my mind, I see it as an agent-based, where somebody has to actually take a piece of JavaScript and add it to your page as a developer. So you have to be savvy enough to say, okay, I get this JavaScript that's from a provider that says that they can meet 643 and 1161, but it requires me to put this thing into my page. And, it's not that hard. It's a cut and paste, but some people, small merchants, may not even really know how to do that. So then there might be a reason why we need an agentless solution, something that doesn't require software development. Maybe they don't even have access to the development environment sometimes, these people that are trying to get compliant. So,
well, and then there's
those two solutions.
There's also the discomfort of adding any kind of a script on your page. Like, exactly. I mean, we are going, do you know are your scripts authorized? And you're like, oh, one more script.
You have too many scripts. Here, add another one.
But I'm not saying we're not trying to diss those solutions. I think a script-based solution for 1161 and 643 is a viable solution, but it's just one more thing you have to think about. Make sure that you're covering that. So why don't you guys talk more about about that?
Well, there are some advantages to a script-based solution, and we've certainly explored those.
An agent-based,
yeah,
right?
Agent-based solution. Number one, you can monitor every single transaction. So every single transaction that's going through, you're right there. And if anything goes wrong, you've got a front row seat.
Let's go back a second. And, you two guys already kind of understand in your minds, like, well, it just happens. I don't even know how that happens. So when you say that I can add a script that monitors everything, how does it do that? Does it put itself in front of everything? Is it become like a proxy and all the traffic has to go through it? Why does that script become all powerful?
Yeah, that script ultimately it is the first thing that you load into that DOM. We're going to step back into the technical. I apologize, but that's what they brought me here for, is the technical.
It's the bots.
It's the bots.
So when you load the JavaScript, it's going to be the first thing that's loaded into the DOM. And what that JavaScript does is ultimately it wraps everything that the browser can do and everything that you can do inside the browser so that it can profile any other JavaScript and determine what it's doing. So think of it like a sandbox. It's going to build like a firewall. It's going to build a firewall between every JavaScript and any action that it's going to try and take. And then they can use heuristics to try and determine, hey, this JavaScript's doing something new, or this JavaScript actually grabbed a credit card number, or it's sending off a request to a new web page. But that means because it's the first thing loaded into the DOM, any visitor that comes to your web page, they're going to have that sandbox there. They're going to have that script that is loaded that's ultimately listening to what they're doing on the page.
Is that a processing hit? Is that something that...
It can be, yes.
And you say it wraps it and determines, does it just be aware of every type of transaction or every type of script that gets loaded, or does it prevent them?
It can do both. Like it ultimately, they're putting themselves in a position almost like antivirus. If you think of antivirus on your computer, Aaron had made the comparison that these browsers today are basically operating systems is how they work. So these inline scripts are basically like an antivirus running on your computer. An antivirus can just report you and notify you. It can quarantine that JavaScript and just put it to the side, or quarantine a virus, something that it sees malicious, or some antivirus will actually just delete it immediately and shut down any processes that were associated with it. So you've got different actions that can take, and these JavaScript can do the same thing.
So, because I know that my merchants are going to be asking me, well, what happens if it's like false? So in other words, if they're going to choose an agent-based solution, that's one of the questions I think that people need to ask is, can this potentially stop a transaction from going through? Because that could potentially raise some issues if they're not aware that that is something that could happen.
Yeah, it could happen. If you make a change that they weren't expecting on their webpage, then they may determine that you are a threat and you're trying to get to that credit card data and you weren't approved. So yes, being blocked is a potential. So you'll want to work with whichever provider you end up going with and make sure that you're aware of what to do to prevent that from ever happening.
Right.
I can't speak to the hows because it's so vendor
it's going to be different from vendor to vendor, but I think it's a valid question for merchants to ask as they're implementing.
And I want to make one quick point here. A point of compliance order, I suppose, is that I think a lot of people that I've talked to say that prevention that we've talked about here, that Chad talked about, is a requirement in PCI DSS, that when you see one of these scripts happening or doing some indicator of compromise or whatever, that you must prevent it. And I think that's not the interpretation of the standard. The standard just says alert. I'm not saying that prevention is bad. It's going kind of the extra mile, and the standard is the low part of security.
Yeah.
So prevention could be possible, but just to be clear, the standard says alert, not alert and block, or alert and
so
prevent.
Potentially a business decision based on a risk analysis, and another thing to think about as because people are implementing something brand new, and there are a lot of questions that might not even have occurred to a lot of merchants yet. So I'm trying to get ahead of people asking me these questions because I know they will. That this is a new thing that we're all trying to get into place.
I think there's kind of an innate fear in the back of some people's mind that if we put a systemic solution in like an agent that we embed on the page, could there be a catastrophic failure where it shuts down every single transaction and our website is down and it's labeling everybody? What do you think, Chad? Could something like that happen?
Oh yeah, I mentioned earlier, I've seen it happen with CSP, and I don't want to, this is not me guessing that it's going to happen in the future, but we saw what happened with CrowdStrike with a bad update.
Yeah.
And CrowdStrike was an endpoint like antivirus. And I just compared an agent-based solution to antivirus.
What if they make a bad update? Yeah.
So it's a potential risk that people need to be aware of.
Yeah. Ultimately, I would say you want to make sure that you vet your vendor, whoever you're going with, to make sure that you trust them, but know that even that isn't a foolproof solution. So there is no guarantee.
How does the agentless solution get around that?
Well, the agentless solution does not run inside the browser, so its visibility is much reduced, dramatically reduced. An agentless solution is something that is going to go through the checkout experience, and then it's going to get from a browser, right? Because that's one of the requirements, but it's going to be a browser that vendor controls, and then they're going to do an evaluation from inside of that controlled environment. So it's completely independent. It isn't a vulnerability scan. I want to be very clear of it, but you can look at it being performed much in the same way as an external vulnerability scan that's required in PCI today. That infrastructure is completely independent from your infrastructure. And that has some major advantages that come with it, because if you're going to embed JavaScript to do the agent solution, that JavaScript becomes a part of your code commits that you're doing. There could be some configuration changes that you're going to have to make. So your development process is going to have to adapt to that vendor.
And you have to vet their security as well, right? Potentially.
Yes. But an agentless solution, because just like a VA scan, they're completely independent of you. There is no way that agentless solution could ever impact the security of any of your transactions that are happening. And it happens entirely independent of all your configuration changes, your code changes. It's completely separate from all of your processes.
So is an agentless, like you can almost think of it as a virtual person making a transaction and then allowing, a company to look at all of the things that happen during that transaction.
It's like the secret shopper concept,
right?
Where
there you go.
You hire somebody to come in and vet your store, check out your store. See how the customer service is, see how the checkout process is. It's kind of that concept where we would come in and we would simulate a real world transaction. It doesn't look any different in the logs. The attackers never know that we're there, which is another downfall of an agent-based one. Sometimes the attackers know, your code is right there on the page for anybody to see.
So they can see the.
With an agentless one, there's no way to shut us down because there's nothing on that page for anybody to mess with.
I want to dive into this for you two just for a second. Sorry, Jen.
No, you're good. Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about we talked earlier, I said earlier that 30% of the websites might be vulnerable to compromise. So in other words, many of these compromises we're talking about assumes that, or all of them maybe assume that the bad guy has control and is inside your web server, right? In some ways, maybe not, but some of them do. So if the guy is on your web server and he's looking at the code and he can see you've just loaded an agent-based solution, can he change that code to just remove the agent-based solution?
If he's got access, he can.
And again, this isn't where the place where all the compromises are occurring, but some of them are that the bad guy has root access to your systems. The other compromises are happening because they're being loaded from malicious sites or sites that have been compromised by somebody else. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, going along with what you're saying, Gary, they actually don't even have to remove it. The premise of an agent-based solution is it's the first thing loaded into the DOM. All they have to do is insert their JavaScript above that. Oh. Because now they can no longer wrap it in time before these guys already have access to what they need to have access to.
Interesting.
So there are ways that because they can now wrap the wrapper. And so they don't have to remove it, because removing it, an agent-based solution may say, well, we'll notice the moment that goes down.
So this brings here's my compliance brain thinking again, Jen, and Jen probably thinking the same thing. So we know that SAQA doesn't have a whole lot of controls around edge security, right? I mean, they're adding ASV scans because that's one attempt.
Right.
But I mean, as an auditor, we don't go through
We don't
section
look at
1,
their firewalls.
section
We
2.
don't look at their hardening.
We don't go through anything for edge security. So what we're assuming, and what SEQA has assumed for years and years, is that, well, they can't attack the website that, you can't get the credit card data because it's a third-party payment script and a payment page and all this kind of stuff. But what we're saying now, and I want to make sure our audience understands this, is that you can be doing an SAQA and have one of the solutions for 11.6.1 and not worry about your firewall. Somebody breaks in and does exactly what Chad said, puts their stuff in front of your script. So we're asking people in SAQA to do these things which help reduce the risk a little bit, but we still may be saying 30% of the world is vulnerable. And we're not addressing that problem necessarily.
Maybe. And it's a conversation. So I always try to have that conversation with the people that I work with is, let's talk about security. Let's talk about what we're seeing in the real world. And then we'll talk about what PCI says. Are you going to pass your PCI assessment by doing only these things? Yes. Are you still vulnerable? Yes. And that's something not to scare people or anything, but it's important to have a security program beyond PCI because of some of these things we're talking about.
Assess the risks that you may, and understand what those risks are.
Yeah. And one thing I would just hurry and interject here is that no solution is ever going to be foolproof. Right. So like vulnerability scanning, we have a standard that we have to go and adhere to be an ASV. But even ASVs aren't foolproof. We will miss vulnerabilities on occasion. And so the agentless or agent-based solution, we talked about some shortcomings there, but there are also shortcomings of an agentless solution as well. So I just want to make sure, especially to make sure our viewers are educated, an agentless solution, like what we talked about, the phantom shopper, I think is what Aaron called it. They may only be coming from one geographical region. And if you're a global company, then you may have regional CDNs, and those compromises could be a regional thing. Right. And so when it comes to choosing between an agent and an agentless, it's important to know that there are pros and there are cons to either side. And some solutions, like some companies want an agentless, but because of how their website processes, they really need to get an agent-based solution. Right. Vice versa.
And it may even be a combination of both solutions that you want to implement in your corporation.
And there are ways we can adapt an agentless one. We can simulate shopping experiences from different geographic regions. We can use different browsers and mobile browsers. And it just depends on what SLA you really want to do for that type of solution.
Right. I wanted to follow up on that a little bit, Chad. I think earlier you said, and perhaps I misunderstood you, but I think you said that agentless has less visibility than agent-based. Is that what I heard you say, or was that incorrect?
Oh, by definition, much less. And for some companies, that's desired.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. So I just was wondering, does that mean they're going to miss something if it's agentless?
I want to expand a little bit on that. So I've done pen tests in environments where they are processing over 1,000 transactions every second. And in those environments, because they have thousands coming in, they don't want to assess the security of all 1,000 of those. They don't want every single one of their customers, because they know their customers are running legacy hardware, and an agent solution can impact that processing time, as Gary had alluded to.
It can create a huge footprint.
And so for companies like that, they may choose and say, do you want to know what? We just want it tested daily. One of the things we haven't even come back to yet is that you can choose how frequently, based on a risk assessment, to run this. If you're processing 2 credit card numbers a year through your website, then does it make sense from a risk assessment to run it weekly? Or maybe you run it even less frequently than weekly. Right. And so again, like, it comes back to what is their goals, like what best fits how they process cards and their environment.
That's why both solutions are important, I think. Right.
Right.
Yes. I just don't want customers, like listeners, walking away thinking SecurityMetrics is saying, Agentless
Right.
is this shining silver bullet, because both of them are silver bullets and they both have values.
Right.
Great.
They both have
kind of where you're going after, what market. And I think here at SecurityMetrics, we really have always been focused on small merchants in a big way. I mean, kind of Jen and I's part of the company, and Aaron and Chad, we all kind of work with maybe enterprise level people. But there's a whole nother group of SQA people, smaller merchants, that are having to deal with this. And you say to them, all you have to do is install this software, or, put this software in your script, in your payment page. And they go, payment what, where, and how, and what, exactly, where does it need to go? So how do I know? So that can be difficult for really small merchants. So is there a solution that may be more effective in actually protecting the problem that we have that we see that there is? It's a small merchant problem.
Right.
It's not a big service provider problem. It's a small merchant problem. So how do we address that small merchant problem? And how does an agent-less solution help that problem?
Right. And I think we have so far been extremely cautious about saying, and therefore SecurityMetrics does this thing, right? But we do have this thing, and it's called Shopping Cart Monitor. And I think it's okay that we talk about our product a little bit now that we've really weighed, what are the pros and cons of various ways of doing things. I think there's value in talking about how we do it now, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, one of the most awesome things about Shopping Cart Monitor is there is nothing to install.
Mm-hmm.
If we've got the URL, we can point our tools at the shopping cart, and it'll go and do its thing. And the configuration, the setup is so much more streamlined and easy than having to go insert something and make sure it's compatible, make sure it doesn't break your shopping cart. So that is one of the main benefits for a smaller merchant that may not have the technical expertise
and the money.
Yeah.
And the money to be able to spend on some of these.
There are some pricey solutions out there for sure.
Yeah, there's some really pricey solutions that are just, frankly, really impossible for a small merchant to meet those fee levels.
Right.
Yeah, when we started working on our solution, our first solution, we started in 2019 trying to bring a product to the market. And we ran that product for the past 5 years, and we have version 2 that's come out, and it's been released for a limited release so far. But when we started, even 5 years ago, and every other time that we've talked about this solution, we have always started from the perspective of how do we help the most merchants as possible, especially small to medium-sized merchants, because that's where we help the majority of our customers are those. And secondly, how do we make it as streamless and stress-free as possible for these environments? So for us, that's where agentless became a no-brainer. It was like, that is the only option if you're trying to accomplish both of those things. And so for our solution, as Aaron said before, is customers will come to us, they'll provide us the website that they have a shopping cart on, and then right now, that is all that they have to do. And we go through during the limited release, and we will actually do this for them weekly so that they can get familiar with it. Now, when we do our full release, which should be coming in the next month or so pay attention to our news feeds. But when we do the full release, we'll actually have the tool on the website that merchants will be able to go into the website. They'll be able to have a embedded, what looks like a mini browser open to their website, go through the checkout process. And once they're done shopping, once they've completed that shopping step, then that data goes over to our analysis. Well, we'll break it down and look for those indicators of compromise. We'll identify all the JavaScript that was loaded on that payment page, and we'll be able to give them a simplified view into that. It'll be an interface it is an interface that can both manage the JavaScript and allow you to do your inventory right there in our website so that you're accomplishing 643, as well as it'll report any IOCs that are detected or changes, updates to security headers in order to accomplish 11.6.1 as well. So ultimately, that's the solution that we've tried to develop over the past 5 years.
Right. And like he said, we've been doing this for quite a while, and it's really cool that these two techie nerds are with Jen and I as QSAs today, because I think they really have, I go to these guys and say, please explain to me why this is happening, because I really can't do it. I can't understand it. And it's a deep, hard thing. And part of our job as QSAs and basically as a company, SecurityMetrics, is to help people understand at the level they can understand what these tools are needed to do and how to do it. There's, I think, another product I'd like to mention too that Aaron's group runs, and that's called Shopping Cart Inspect. So if you don't want to jump into a monitor solution and you just want, let's say it's between now and the end of this year or between now and March. Well, don't make it all the way to March.
Do not wait till March.
Between now and December, now and January, you just want to get an experience with, well, what really is on my site and how can I not jump into the pool, but dip my toe into the pool and find out how my website is faring. Yeah. And that's kind of a one-time analysis for a pretty cost-effective
shopping cart inspect service that we do in forensics.
Yeah,
that's kind of a little mini forensic that we do, where we review your public-facing code. Exactly what the customer sees in the browser. We go through, we look at all the JavaScripts, inventory those JavaScripts, and it also works really well in tandem with Shopping Cart Monitor because if you do a shopping cart inspect first, we go through and look at it and make sure that those scripts are behaving properly so that you're not whitelisting any of those potentially malicious scripts that could then, potentially be let by any type of monitoring tool.
So shopping cart inspect is something that somebody could do today,
yes,
right? And really get a good start, a good understanding of 11.6.1 and 6.4.3 without committing to a solution. And we're not saying if you use shopping cart inspect, you don't have to use shopping cart monitor, but it's a great way to probably get started. And if you don't know where to start and you're worried about March 31st coming up, here's a place to start. So I'm sure we'll have a link somewhere.
It's amazing how many times we get shopping carts inspects in where we go through and do the analysis and find malware when there was no suspicion that there was even anything wrong. Right. I think the last statistics I looked at were something like 7% of our cases that came in.
Oh, wow.
Where they just did it to do it. They didn't have a CPP report or nobody was reporting fraud. We went in and found some malicious activity happening on their website.
So it's almost a 1 in 10 chance that you might have something going on there. So
always better to find it before you get a report.
Yes.
And this won't affect your compliance at all statements right now. Even if you're in the middle of anything, you can do one of these. So we've talked a lot. There's been a lot of stuff probably to remember. If we were to summarize, what are some of the necessary features of a tool that needs to do this? So if I were to try to summarize, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here or add to it, the first thing needs to be during this discovery phase, right, when we're looking at a website to see how many scripts there are, what's going on, that has to occur at what Chad calls the DOM level, the document object model. So this all has to be happening there. So if you're looking at a tool that there's going to be a lot of people, I think, that come out in the next 6 months, year saying, we do 6.4.3, we do 11.6.1, you go with us and we're going to do it. I worry about QSAs out there just saying, well, it says they did 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. What's my, I don't know enough to go test that. Yeah. And I don't have a tool to go test that.
No.
Because we just basically trust whoever does that. And the same with consumers out there who are buying this service. There are a lot of really great solutions out there. There's going to be more. Will there be different quality levels? I assume so, probably, right? Because that's how the world works, right? So what are some questions that you need to be aware of that you can say to your solution provider when they say, no, we've got your back. We do 11.6.1, we do 6.4.3. And you say, okay, well, do you do a dynamic analysis in the DOM? Does it cover from the very beginning of the load all the way to the very last typing of the CVV data, right? Is there anything else in that data gathering? Are there good questions that they could ask in that data gathering?
Yeah, the next thing I would look at is what does your interface look like for me to be able to manage my scripts? Because if they're going to be doing that, like we said, there's daisy chains 6, 8, 9 layers deep. Where do you want to manage that? Does their interface provide you a place that you feel that your organization and your processes will be successful?
Okay, so there's a good one. Show me your interface for looking at the scripts.
Show me my
justifying
JavaScripts. Show me my JavaScripts and show me my alerts.
So the discovery phase, dynamic DOM, super important. Show me what, that I can see what's going on. How can I justify them? So then the next part that Chad called basically our analysis part. After we do the phantom shopping, we send it, or anyone would have to send it to some sort of analysis portion. What are some of the features of this analysis that need to be asked about, right? Are you looking at dynamic scripts? Are you looking at generated scripts? Are you, I'm just making up some of these things. Are you, what is an indicator of compromise, and how many indicators of compromise are you looking for? And where did you get those indicators of compromise? Do you guys have anything to say about this analysis thing that would help people know whether they're getting a good solution?
Yeah, I'm going to throw out, you're going to see a lot of my background come here because I spend a lot of time helping our ASV team over the past few years, our vulnerability scan product. And one of the things that I'm hugely passionate about is don't go after the number of IOCs or don't go after the number of plugins specifically for vulnerability scans, because just because they look for more things, that could also mean that you're going to get more alert fatigue. Most organizations are not ready to take on 5, 6, 10 alerts in a week that are going to cost their employees 30 minutes to an hour or an hour and a half to go and investigate. So knowing more about what type of things do you report, how frequently are you reporting them, what can I expect for time investment that we need to invest to support this product, those would probably be the questions I would ask. I think there definitely is an element of how do I know that they're an authority or not? Like, is this a college graduate who has no real world experience, or do they have a forensics organization like SecurityMetrics does in Aaron's team that's actually providing research and evidence to build a product around? And so I would ask some questions about, like, how do you determine what you're going to flag for? What does that process look like? But I would be sure or be wary of just looking at what are the numbers, what type of alerts am I going to see?
Okay. And that kind of gets to the third phase, which is reporting. So is there some kind of minimum, required reporting or things that you would look for a solution? How do I know when something is sent to me? How do I know how bad it is and what I'm supposed to do about it?
That's where support would come in, right? Is like, what type of support will you guys offer us? If we need consultation, can we get consultation from you? Or are you just going to give me it and expect me and my team to be able to research and understand it? So understanding more of what the contract is. I've been alluding to it, but one thing, if you read under all the comments I've made throughout this section here, it's all about what type of organization am I? And what type of investment am I ready to make in this tool and in this process? If you're a company that looks at PCI as a bunch of check boxes, then going with the best solution that requires 3 to 4 hours a week of your time probably isn't going to give you your money's return. And if you're a small organization that needs to be nimble and quick and you need efficient reporting, then you want to make sure, again, that you're going with a solution that frowns upon false positives. And so when it comes to reporting, it's going to be under that same tone of what type of organization are you and what are you looking for?
Okay, and here's my or do you have something else you want to add?
Oh, I was just going to make a quip. If you really wanted to test them out, go change your URL to your iframe and see if it alerts.
See if it catches it.
All right. So,
Ironically, Aaron, I had a pen test customer call me last year, and we were talking about a solution they had just bought. This was before it was officially released. He's like, I bought these guys. We went and changed the iframe. We changed who we process with. We changed everything. And they didn't notice for a month until I.
No.
And so he's like, I quit that contract in a second. He's like,
maybe test it out, right? So that might be something.
Well, I mean, I was saying that tongue in cheek, but
yeah,
but it might not be a bad idea to test it out.
And now here's the last question I had, because I had this in an audit this summer. Somebody talked to me, and this organization, very sharp, really good development team, 30 developers. It's a great company. They're really sharp. And their first question was, and the developers, when I was on the phone with them, said, well, we can write this our own. We can do our own. How hard can it be? So I guess with your two guys' experience over the last 5 years, How would you address that to a developer saying, well, it can't be that hard. I can just write it myself. How hard can it be?
My response would be good luck. It gets complicated, and you may be able to pull off a simple solution, but I would have my doubts if you're really getting down to the nitty gritty of what's going on in the browser. Are you checking local storage to see if scripts are being written into local storage? Are you checking for scripts inside of cookies? All these methods that the attackers use to hide their malware in places you would not even dream of as a normal developer. Hackers are very good at hiding their stuff in places that aren't being observed. So you could write some quick little program to monitor what's there, but are you really checking all of the dynamic scripts? If a script changes, do you have the ability to determine what type of a change it was? So all those type of issues come into play. And we've been doing this for years now. Chad and I have met fairly regularly over the years, looking at all the different ways that attackers are getting in and exploiting things. And so it can get really complicated. I'm not saying you couldn't do it. If you have the skills, by all means. But
then as an assessor, I mean, not to overburden PCI further, but how do I know that the solution that they're using meets all these things? I mean, this seems technical enough that, and stop me if I'm wrong, it seems like it would be a good candidate for something like the ASV program.
Yeah. And I frankly have brought this up with the PCI Council. I don't know where in the long run it'll go, but I think they recognize that this is harder than ASV. And there are some movements starting now at the council to try to get their arms around how do we really, does it make sense to validate some of these solutions? I don't know. And I'm not going to say that they're going to do one thing or other. All I can say is they have an ASV program, and this is way harder than that. So is it a candidate for something in the future? Potentially. Yeah.
It would make my job easier. So if you could make that happen, thanks.
So Chad, did you have anything that you wanted to add about, could somebody write this on their own? He's kind of been doing a lot of the writing of this.
Yeah, I've talked to developers from customers and from other organizations both. And I think that you could do this on your own if you wanted to. But the thing I would bring it back to is the last time that you developed something that was not within your subject matter experience, like where you're an expert in, how long did it take you to notice that it wasn't running properly, and how much time did you invest both in building it and then to fix the problems that inevitably came?
And we laughed and laughed.
And we laugh because we've all done that. We've all been there. And so what I always respond with is, okay, then I would take those hours, I would add 50%, just like you would if you were estimating it for your management.
Right.
And then ask them, what is your time worth? And then compare that against what solutions are out there. Maybe you don't go with a pro version. Maybe you choose a basic version because of who you are and where your priorities are. But it would allow them to at least start to say, okay, do I want to build it? If we're going to build it, what's a metric look like? And then how do I compare that? That's how I would recommend they go about making that decision.
Nice. Good advice.
So it's not just CSP.
Nope.
It's going to be more. We've already addressed that. So I think if people are out there thinking about developing their own, just realize we think it's hard.
Yeah. And
we've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah, and it's so important to emphasize that you can't outsource all the responsibility. If you're using iframes, great. We want you using iframes. They do so much to protect that card data, but you still have to lock your doors and windows.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It was a delight speaking with all of you, especially all together. I think this was the cross-functional conversation that really needed to happen, and I appreciate your time.
Been great. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of Security Metrics podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.